Hello and welcome to Policy Watch, your packed snapshot on the week's biggest business developments, their context, relevance and impact. I'm Govindraj, Ethiraj. This week, the President outlined the measures and reforms that Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government wishes to take to put the economy in a high growth trajectory. At the very start of his address, the President spoke of the need to address inflation. Let's listen to what he has to say.
Thus, putting the Indian economy back on track is paramount for my government. We will work together to usher our economy into a high growth path, rein in inflation, reignite investment cycles, accelerate job creation, and restore the confidence of the domestic as well as international community in our economy.
Well, joining me now is Shubhada, Chief Economist, Yes Bank, and Siddharth, Sanyal, also Chief Economist at Barclays Bank. Thank you both for joining us. So we're looking at a headline inflation figure, Shubhada, of 8.28%, and it's been over 8% for obviously a long time now. What is the primary challenge here?
I think the key challenges are both in terms of food inflation and non-food inflation. If we are talking of the consumer price inflation index, which is critical for monetary policy framework. So if we are looking at the disaggregated direction, both in food and non-food, food has been a bugbear for quite some time. Supply shocks have been severe, both in terms of perishables and random supply shocks in other food items like cereals or pulses and oilseeds, more importantly. So altogether, these have been exerting a consistent pressure on prices remaining firm.
So where have we been more unprepared in terms of managing each of these disaggregated shocks, as you've called it?
I would like to take this at a two-level problem. One, that we have not responded to the changing composition of consumption, and two, I think we haven't also paid adequate attention to the distributional aspect of food. This particularly arises in terms of perishables, where you have issues like APMC, which actually have been more hindrance rather than facilitators as far as supplies are concerned.
So you're saying the regulatory structure itself is an inhibitant in some ways.
Yes.
Siddharth, how do you read the larger problem of inflation and the attempts now being made to tackle it?
Completely agree with Shubhada what she said in the beginning. To add to that, as a result, what has happened, inflation expectation has been, it has got serious damage over a period of time. Now we have seen a situation.
So when you say serious damage, you mean?
Okay, let me put it this way. Last 4 or 5 years, if I see, barring 1 year, weather situation was relatively favorable. Food grain production, etc. Every year we ceremoniously announce that it has reached a new high. Yet food inflation, if it runs into double digit and at times at 20% kind of level, there is something wrong in the overall system. So that's a big challenge. That has been a big lacuna on the part of our overall policymakers, I would say. And in the process, what has happened at a household level, at a level of industry, you always tend to expect inflation to stay high, and this kind of things, financial markets or inflation expectation, has some kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So
you're saying the way savings get channelized, the way you plan for your future, and that has a fundamental impact on the economy itself.
Yeah, and something even more basic, the small business owner, if he is using vegetables as his input, he will factor in, it will go up 10%, let me mark up my prices by 10% or 12% or 15%.
So you're saying that we are dealing with something more fundamental, the psychology of inflation rather than the physical impact of inflation. So where do we begin?
I think inflation expectations quite clearly have a high inflation expectations distort, as Siddharth was saying, savings behavior. They distort the allocational behavior in the economy. So in summary, I can say that it has a very suboptimal solution as far as economic equilibrium is concerned. You need to therefore, and if you look at household expectations, a large part of these household expectations emanate from how the food and fuel prices behave. And if these two components of overall inflation have remained high, household expectations continue to remain high. More importantly, if food inflation persists for a very long time, it obviously has its negative spillover on broad generalized price level through wages. I mean, food being the basic component of consumption, if that itself is causing damage to your available disposable income.
Right. So, Siddharth, how much damage has food caused to the inflation bucket as a whole? I mean, and to what extent should we be talking about food and talking about other components?
Well, if you it depends a lot which inflation indicator you pick up.
Yeah.
If pick up
consumer price
if you pick up the consumer price index, straight away the weight is about 50%. So it's at least 50%, but possibly even more, because as she was rightly pointing out, that it has a direct feedback mechanism to some of the other prices like wages and some of the other elements. So it's possibly even more than 50%, and that's why the impact is very, very strong.
Right. So if we were to start now attacking this in an unbundled way, as you pointed out, where would we begin? I mean, whether it's the psychology or the physical, and if it's physical, then is it supply side, and then what?
I think the first point is, do I actually take concrete steps to arrest, to the extent possible, the price pressures? So how do I look at the distribution mechanism? Do I look at medium-term measures, or first upfront do I look at contingency measures? In the very current scenario, probably the first risk that I would look at is a El Nino. If it completely plays out as per the severity that has been anticipated by some, then what impact would it have on some of the food grain items? As a government, what policy measures can I take upfront proactively to contain those price pressures to the extent possible? If that is shown in evidence.
So you're saying effectively that the economy better be prepared for a double whammy.
Absolutely, they need
and that should be clear to everyone who's watching this.
You know, forewarned is forearmed. They need to have a contingency plan of offloading food stocks through PDS, you know, creating alternate supplies through imports and so on. I think these are the quick fix measures. That does not take away, of course, the importance of
but
the
that you're saying
measures.
should be done if something goes wrong with the monsoons, or even otherwise?
Well, I think as the monsoon progresses and you can relatively depend on the weather forecasters, you have a fair cue of what the rain will be in terms of geographical distribution and time-wise distribution. So if both are seriously suboptimal, then clearly repercussions would be on agriculture output. In that case, you already have the food map of the country. You know what kind of food components are going to see severe supply side pressure, and accordingly devise a plan to meet the contingencies. I think that's
so
that's
the contingency side. What is the non-contingency side? Assuming, let's say, it was looking like monsoons were going to be normal, Siddharth.
So in terms of the longer term plan, I think there are 4 or 5 areas which needs some kind of long term planning. One is and step by step, starting from the food growing part. First of all, the technology part involved with agriculture. Which kind of seeds you are using, which kind of fertilizer you are using, are you trying to optimize your 1 year's production or a slightly longer term production? So you need to have a concrete planning on that part. Number 2, definitely we talk a lot about it, irrigation. That's important. That's growing in case of India, but not maybe at the optimal pace. And the actual expenditure in terms of generating more irrigation is actually not huge. The third part, so this is the production part.
But you're saying these are all the building blocks for good agricultural
output over a long term period.
Yeah.
But fortunately, this can actually, you can make a difference in say 3 to 5 years time in these areas. These are not huge gestation projects, thankfully. And one important area, and if you ask me the most important area, I'd possibly say the third stage, which is storage, agricultural storage. So even in the last few years or last few months, when you have seen heavy volatility in food prices, they had come more from say vegetable prices or perishable products. And there the role of storage is immense. So and that way, if you can actually improve the storage facility distribution, that will actually do wonders.
Right. So to come back to the original question, right? So the president spoke about the measures and reforms to tackle inflation, and he says, and this obviously links to the larger challenge of growth and so on. Now, we've talked about a crisis kind of situation and a non-crisis situation. In a non-crisis situation or a crisis situation, we are saying the important thing is to unbundle everything and start attacking them piece by piece. Now the question therefore is, what's the timeline? I mean, when can we, after all, most people want to see results in 100 days, or at least the beginning of results in 100 days. Shubhada?
I think parallelly to the contingency efforts, obviously you cannot lose sight of what needs to be done over the next 2 to 3 years, as Siddharth was also saying. Critical would be, as was also outlined in the President's address.
So it appeared to me from what Siddharth was saying that a lot of things are in our control.
Are very much in our control. It is the will to implement.
It's doable and not really dependent on natural resources, not dependent on any other country, and not huge expenditure projects.
Yeah, it's like
so capital formation in agriculture, creating agri-rail networks, which the President has talked about, which would have quick turnaround times, unbundling of Food Corporation of India, which can actually create to very efficient supply system for food. As we all know, India grows, most of the things, it's in the top 5 in terms of food production, even in horticulture. But what does happen? The prices still remain where they are. It's purely because things like cold storage, warehouses, create some innovative ways to look at how warehouse financing can be done. Warehouse receipts could be one. So basically you are inviting.
Would that be needed as a budgetary intervention, or could that happen even otherwise?
I think you need to create a policy which would then attract the private players to get in. Let's not forget the capital formation in agriculture has remained abysmally low, below 8% for the years that I can remember the data of. And the main reason is because you need a strong policy framework. A long pending issue is that of economic size of holding for farms. Now we do not see that. We see a fragmented farming land, and that is uneconomical most of the time. So you need to first create economic size of holding. You need to harness technology. You have to have innovative ideas.
Right. So I mean, so you're really going downstream and saying, okay, let's start with the basic starting point.
So with contingency, you cannot really lose sight of what you need to do.
And you were earlier telling me that the NDA regime in 2002 did unload surplus food stocks into the. Actually,
we were doing a quick exercise as to what would happen if the Food Corporation of India does indeed allow itself to offload those food stocks. We saw that in 2002-2004, where 60 million tons came down to 25 or odd million tons. That was the extent of offloading. What did it result in? It resulted in cereal inflation coming actually in negative territory, which to an extent was able to cushion the upside risk that we were seeing through perishables, through pulses, oilseeds, etc. And you won't believe that that kind of inflation trajectory will actually be seen replicating this time around, and therefore it's extremely important. It's extremely important to have proactive steps being taken. And 2003, mind you, was a drought year, and despite that, you saw inflation components getting subdued.
So that last word on this one. So the psychological impact. I mean, what people are expecting, and therefore what determines their behavior. What is the one thing that you would suggest or you would do if given a chance?
Well, I would say some kind of clear message from the government that okay, we are vigilant about this particular issue and will ensure that food inflation will contain. Try to give a number that will try to ensure we at least this segment.
And the one supply side action that you will take to help make this happen.
In the long term, if I can select just one, I'd go for storage.
Okay.
In the long term, in the near term, it's more critical, but it's relatively easy that you offload food stocks. You ensure strategic import.
Right. We need to take a break on this, but we'll come back on Policy Watch and talk about some of the challenges in infrastructure as the President's speech outlined. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're still with Policy Watch. Another key area that the government wishes to address is infrastructure. Here's what the President said in his speech.
A fast-track investment-friendly and predictable PPP mechanism will be put in place. Modernization and revamping of railways is on top of the infrastructure agenda. My government will launch a diamond quadrilateral project of high-speed trains. The country will have a network of freight corridors with specialized agri-railway networks for perishable agricultural products.
Well, still with me, Shubhada Rao and Siddharth Sanyal. Shubhada, let me begin with you, right? So we've identified infrastructure as a key area to pay attention to, which of course is a no-brainer. But what's your sense? Where do we begin once again, and how does that link to some of the larger problems that we've been facing as a slowing economy?
I think the key biggest hurdle for India's economy not realizing its potential is a lack of sincere effort on infrastructure. Though we have identified the needs, as we know, it was identified that you need $1 trillion to, for the flagship infrastructure programs, but the entire sector was fraught by policy problems. One, the environment and forest related clearances, and two, the more important one I would think also is land acquisition. I think these two, and in addition to that, the pricing problem, user charges, etc. But those are at level 2. First is the creation of infrastructure, and those were running into the biggest
user
hurdles.
charges, but you're not saying cost. You're saying cost is not
costs and user charges,
both,
being
okay.
able to make it economical to run a program. Roads and tolls, for instance, need those more sensible pricing and user charges framework. But more importantly, I think to start the infrastructure project, the delays, the time and cost delays were essentially because the land issue was still getting sorted.
Right. So Siddharth, again, if we were to start unpacking that a little bit, which areas within infrastructure you feel are deserving of greater and more sort of quicker?
Well, in case of infrastructure, the typical style is that the first move would have to be on the part of the government, and that typically over a period of time has a virtuous crowding in effect. Now, in case of the government, then you have to target the low-hanging fruits, and low-hanging fruits can be where without spending a penny, you can actually disentangle some of the litigation issues, judicial intervention issues, or some of the issues like where there are issues of two ministries having difference of opinion. I think the third factor is the easiest to solve or attack to start with. So something like in the area of power or coal, where they have a difference of opinion with the say, environment ministry. Now a new government in place without any baggage, they will possibly
can get everyone into a room and sort things out.
Exactly. Okay. Possibly that will be the first area to first step.
Okay.
And once you have that, typically these big projects do attract a few feeder projects, and which can actually be private initiative more often than not. So,
right.
Yeah.
So what about things like, in roads, for instance, we saw the situation where a lot of private players walked away because they found fundamentally the whole thing very unviable. Is that something that can be resolved only because the government is getting its policy side together?
See, in case of roads, I would say the land problem is often huge, because you are building a 100-kilometer stretch, and in between, if there is for 2 kilometers there is a land related problem, your whole project gets stuck.
Correct.
So you have to have a clear policy in place, framework in place, so that someone is very clear from day one before investing money there. Number 2 is cost of fund and liquidity in the system, which will hopefully eventually will smooth out a bit over the next 6 to 12 months, hopefully.
So how will that happen? I mean, a lot of people I talk to, for instance, say that banks will find it challenging to do that kind of lending because there are some fundamental problems with bank balance sheets.
Yeah, that is something you cannot ignore, but that depends on what can help is a bit of recovery in the economy. I'm not talking about big structural recoveries very quickly, but a bit of cyclical recovery is still possible. And we, as a house, at least hopeful of some kind of more balanced stance on the part of RBI, simply because if the inflation problem, which had been troubling RBI the most over the last so many months, if that burden is shared equally by both Delhi and Mumbai, possibly RBI can be little more balanced in its approach towards supporting growth or this kind of projects as well.
So you're saying interest rates therefore will come down, or potentially could come down a little bit?
Or liquidity eases a bit.
Okay.
So as a whole, the effect might be a bit soothing in the coming months.
Okay, Shubhada, what are the other parts of the whole infrastructure challenge?
Not that I understand the issue of bidding process, but I'm sure that the road projects did go through a lot of pain because of the faulty bidding agreements and so on. I think that needs to get resolved, having a model agreement and so on. I think that's equally important. Second, to add to what Siddharth was saying, in terms of what are the viable projects and infrastructure having caused a lot of pain to the banking sector because of the policy logjams, I think here one would like to segregate the viable projects and the non-viable projects. The viable projects having temporary mismatch in terms of cash flows.
So when you say non-viable, were these always non-viable or they became non-viable?
I would think they were inherently non-viable because probably they had projected very unrealistic numbers in their project design. But if I talk of viable projects and the economic model is perfect, but because there was a sudden stoppage of mining because of some minister's decision overnight, I know of instance in Andhra Pradesh, for instance, where the power project was designed with sourcing of coal from close by mines, but overnight that rule was changed, that mine was banned, and this power producer was forced to import coal. Completely his financials were going to undergo a serious repercussion, negative repercussion that is, and that also caused your trade deficit if you look at coal imports being forcefully higher. So I think there is if these kind of hurdles are resolved, the projects are still viable. I mean, they are ready for commercial operation. It's just that there has been some temporary mismatch of cash flows because of unforeseen hurdles like these. If these are resolved, I don't see why some of the assets, stressed assets in banking sector should begin to ease off as soon as we see on ground policy implementation. So
are you speaking as a banker or as an economist?
Well, I'm speaking as an economist.
Okay, good. Anyway, so that so this is unlocking what is already locked and lying there. What about the looking ahead? The 100 cities project, the grander stuff. How do you see that coming along, and how is that going to fix some of the larger problems of infrastructure?
Well, that's a long-term view, and obviously sounds very exciting. To start with, I think to modernize, to enhance the railway network can actually do wonders in case of India. It gives you multiple benefits. First of all, it's huge infrastructure projects, develops the feeder infrastructure segment also. At the same time, actually gives a lot of boost to local industry, helps you in terms of tackling inflation problems. So all this, it has multiple benefits. And if you see, this is one particular area. So historically, over the last so many decades, we haven't really grown our railway network, etc., to a great extent.
So I was interviewing Rakesh Mohan a couple of months ago, and he said that basically, even to meet the needs of the coal that has to be supplied to the power, assuming a higher growth level, we need to triple the coal carrying capacity of the Indian Railways. If I remember the number correctly.
So this kind of projects has multiple benefits, both in terms of forward linkage and backward linkage. So this kind of project needs to be identified. Similarly, in case of your what you mentioned about the next level of urbanization, that also creates some kind of job, and in a way, it's a very clear medium-term boost to the economy.
Right. So so we talked about infrastructure. There's infrastructure in general, and there's infrastructure when in the nature of urbanization, cities, and so on. What else is left when it comes to really giving this economy a kick?
I would say in terms of infrastructure also, there are 4 or 5 different buckets. Basically,
and I guess we're mostly talking about physical, at least for now, not social.
So you have
unless you want to talk about social, Shubhada. I'll come back to you. Okay, we'll come to that.
Actually, that's also a very important point. One, I would say, apart from talking about only heavy infrastructure, you need to develop rural infrastructure also in case of India. Very important. And rural infrastructure doesn't mean telephone network or internet penetration,
which is what we have done or are about to complete.
But rather than that, it means irrigation, storage, actual rural electrification, and education and health in rural areas, deep rural areas.
That's your cue, Shubhada. So what's the
Yes,
challenge
absolutely.
on the
I think
social
it's
side?
both physical and soft infrastructure.
Mr.
that
President's
is
pause
equally
speaks
important.
off, but later in the speech.
Absolutely. Coming to, taking off from the point which Siddharth made, a few years ago, we had this most brilliant blueprint of Bharat Nirman. And I thought here was an opportunity to tie up Narega with Bharat Nirman, where you are, giving fiscal stimulus, but at the same time creating assets in rural economy, which is rural electrification, irrigation, housing, the entire flagship program that it was. So it's very important to have a concerted effort on physical infrastructure, integrated approach both for rural, urban, all infrastructure projects, roads, ports, railways, everything needs to be looked at holistically. And for that you need a lot of decentralization in terms of going to the almost district or panchayat or whatever for the actual needs to be identified. Two, the most important to me, I would think, is skill development and health. I think we talk of education, but we need to pay equal emphasis on the employability when we have our youth educated. So there are many instances where there are engineers but who don't know how to operate on the shop floor. So clearly the emphasis has to be equally on not just basic education but skill development. And of course, who can argue and deny the dire need for scaling up health requirements? Good facilities at affordable cost is something that India can really do much more with.
Right. And all of this
technology is very important, and that is where I would think in the presidential address there were two key things which I thought were very important to note. One is the digitization. I think a digital economy helps get efficiencies and cost effectiveness and delivery much better.
Right, and that's the layer which should be sitting on top of all the efforts on the physical infrastructure.
Creating a digital economy is extremely important, especially when you have such a diverse geography. Second, to my mind, I thought, which we haven't really touched upon, which goes beyond the inflation and infrastructure, is I think for the first time I thought that the government was articulating on international economic relations in a very chiseled manner. That we need to identify the regions, the countries, and deepen and penetrate further with economic, bilateral, financial, trade, whatever relations.
Shubhada, right. So I have to interrupt you there. We've run out of time. So I think we've got a good set of points from both of you on the primary issues that we spoke of, that is inflation and managing it, and of course infrastructure and managing that, and the unbundled versions of all of it. Thank you so much for joining us. That's all we have time for in this edition of Policy Watch. Thanks for watching.